Hi, and thanks for joining NSF International's webinar on CDP Climate Change Solutions. In our webinar today, we're going to cover some introductions, an overview of CDP, how NSF can help, a readiness tool, and some closing remarks. Our speakers today are myself, Ryan Daly, Marketing Manager for our Sustainability Division, providing information to potential clients on the breadth of verification and consulting services we provide, and Brittany Sapanik, Senior Project Manager for our Sustainability Consulting Group, assisting clients in measuring and mitigating environmental impacts and specializing in strategy development, data analysis, and sustainability reporting. The purpose of today's webinar is to introduce you to the CDP Climate Change questionnaire, share how NSF can help your company disclose to CDP, and showcase a quick tool that can help assess your readiness for CDP. To help accomplish this first bullet, we have a representative from CDP to tell you a little bit more about the climate change questionnaire.
Hello, everyone. My name is Julia Cassiotti, and I manage our work with companies who are new to CDP to connect them with all of the information and resources they need to respond to a CDP program for the first time. I'll be providing you with an overview of our reporting process and questionnaires. CDP was formed to provide a platform for companies to report on environmental data in a format that is standardized, comparable, aligned with best practices, and centered around issues investors are interested in. To this day, CDP is the only global system for companies and cities to measure, disclose, manage, and share vital environmental information, and it is now used by over 6,000 companies and over 500 cities worldwide. In practice, what this means is that over 650 investors representing $87 trillion in assets have become signatories to CDP. We work on behalf of these major investor groups to collect data from companies through annual thematic questionnaires, then provide it back to them in a standardized, usable way. This enables investors to engage with a large group of companies on environmental issues through one source. CDP collects data from companies through 3 thematic questionnaires: climate change, forests, and water. Companies may be requested to respond to 1, 2, or all 3 of these questionnaires. For those requested on multiple programs, we encourage you to address the topics that are most relevant to your business first. The longest-standing program at CDP, which also has the largest number of responding companies, is the Climate Change Program. Whereas most companies who receive a request to disclose to CDP are requested to complete the Climate Change Questionnaire, the water and forest requests apply to a smaller subset of companies based on the potential of their industry to be impacted by water or forest resources. Although pertaining to different topics, all 3 questionnaires provide companies a platform to communicate to investors on their responsible and proactive management of natural resources. As such, there is one unified deadline to respond to all 3 of these programs, and that is July 31st, 2018. At that point, CDP collects, analyzes, and publishes the data in annual reports. This information is provided not only to the investors and to the public, but also back to you, the companies, so you can learn from the process. I'll now provide a brief overview of each questionnaire, starting with climate change. The Climate Change Questionnaire is 14 modules in total, which comprise both quantitative and qualitative information. We'll just take a look at some of the core components, including governance, strategy, risks and opportunities, and the more quantitative metrics and targets. To get a sense of how these questions are framed, take this example in the governance module, which asks whether there is board-level oversight of climate-related issues within your organization. You have the option of selecting yes and providing context and details around the nature of the board-level oversight, or no and explaining why. Similarly, in the strategy section, this question asks whether climate change is integrated into your business strategy. You can select yes and provide information around how it is integrated, or no and explain why it isn't, or describe plans to implement some management strategy on climate change in the future. This question from the Risks and Opportunities section asks whether you have identified any climate-related risks that have the potential to have a substantive financial or strategic impact on your business. These risk drivers could be associated with the low-carbon transition, such as regulatory risks, market-based, reputational, etc., or they could be physical, if your operations could be impacted by, for example, increasing frequency and severity of natural disasters related to climate change. Like in the previous section, you may select yes and explain how each risk could affect your business and how you are managing for them. You may also select no and explain why various climate-related risks do not affect your business. While the management and risk sections are more focused on a company's narrative around climate change, the last area collects more quantitative data on your energy use and emissions. For instance, this question asks whether the company had an active emissions reduction target during the reporting year. For a company in the earlier stages of their environmental journey, it is important to note that CDP and our requesting investors do not expect every company to have access to all of the information requested. Instead, we encourage companies to start with the information that is most relevant and available to your business this year. For many, that means starting with the more qualitative questions in the climate change questionnaire. Just through the act of compiling and submitting that type of information, you will start key internal conversations and communicate to your investors and other stakeholders that you are aware of and considering these issues. A similar approach can be applied to the water and forest questionnaires in terms of focusing on more qualitative information first. And you'll see some common themes across all three programs in the type of information requested. Moving on to the water questionnaire, you can see some of the core water modules on the slide now. I will not go over each of these sections, but we'll focus on the first few, as those tend to be the most relevant for companies approaching disclosure on water for the first time. The current state module asks companies to provide an overview of the importance of water to your company's operations. So for example, what is your current dependence on water, and do you anticipate that changing in the future? This section asks that you consider dependence on water throughout your upstream and downstream operations, as well as your direct operations. One of the more critical modules in the water questionnaire is that on procedures, which asks for companies information on your company's water-related risk assessment process. In this section, you disclose on your procedures for assessing different aspects of water-related risk, including whether you have evaluated how water risks could affect the success of your organization's growth strategy, how often they are evaluated, and the methods used to assess these risks. Note that you have the option of either describing your water-related risk assessment or explaining why you have not yet undertaken one. In the Risks and Opportunities section for the water questionnaire, companies are given the opportunity to explain how you define substantive risk to your operations related to water. So in this section, based on that definition, you explain what types of water risk may impact your business, which river basins or facilities are exposed to those risks, and how you've responded to those risks. Again, here you have the option of indicating that you have defined a certain threshold for substantive risk, but have not yet identified any existing risks that fall within that threshold. Beyond these qualitative sections, there are questions on facility-level water accounting and targets, but again, the key as a first-time responder is demonstrating to investors that there is a conversation taking place internally around potential water-related risk, and to communicate any steps you're currently taking to manage those risks. Last but certainly not least, we'll take a look at the forest questionnaire, which centers on the 4 commodities that are the greatest global drivers of deforestation: palm oil, timber, cattle, and soy. The questionnaire both assesses and guides a company's journey to remove commodity-driven deforestation from their value chain and hinges on the question of whether any of your direct operations or critical suppliers are exposed to deforestation risks related to those 4 commodities. The forest questionnaire is only relevant to industries who source one or more of these commodities. So I just want to highlight a few potentially affected industries. Food and agriculture and chemicals, for example, could be at risk related to any of these 4 commodities, whereas home furnishings and construction companies are requested based on their potential exposure to risk from just timber. I won't speak too in-depth around the more qualitative components of the forest questionnaire because, as you can see, they are quite similar to those we covered on water. For example, you're requested to provide information on your dependence on the commodity in the current state module, your risk assessment process in the procedure module, and your definition of substantive impact in the risks and opportunities module. The last important section I'll highlight for the forest questionnaire is that on implementation, which gets at the actions you've taken to address potential risks related to the relevant commodities. These could include targets to reduce the use of some commodity, certifications, and engagement with different stakeholders across your value chain. As mentioned previously, CDP and our investor signatories acknowledge that collecting and reporting on this data is a journey, and that companies in the early stages of that journey may not have access to information to respond to each question this year. We encourage you to consider this roadmap towards leadership in environmental management as guided by the CDP Climate Change questionnaire. First, provide some sort of disclosure to indicate that you have an internal conversation taking place around environmental risk. Then, put systems in place to identify and assess potential risks. Then, take steps towards strong climate governance and strategies to manage those risks. And lastly, work towards leadership by setting ambitious targets, engaging with stakeholders along your value chain, and reporting in line with TCFD. The 4 categories laid out by this roadmap correspond to the 4 levels of environmental stewardship represented by CDP scoring. To help guide your journey and track improvement from year to year, responses are assessed against a publicly available scoring methodology. Companies earn a score within one of 4 levels based on response completeness and specific strategies they have in place. These levels range from the disclosure scoring band, indicated by the score of D or D-, to the leadership band, indicated by the score of A or A-. A company that provides no information by the deadline receives a status of F for failure to disclose. This is not meant as a judgment on environmental performance, but rather an indication that no information was provided. Most companies in their first year of submitting a response fall within the disclosure or awareness band, which presents a great opportunity for them to start tracking progress and identify areas to further their strategy in future years. I'll now touch on the question of why companies disclose to CDP. CDP disclosure is valuable to companies in that it aids in communication with different stakeholders, benchmarking, implementation of best practices, and recognition for leadership. First and foremost, by disclosing to CDP, a company is providing information about their environmental risk assessment and management strategies directly to over 650 investors representing over $87 trillion in assets. Our questionnaires ensure this data is disclosed in a standardized and comparable way, providing a tool for investors to use to decarbonize their portfolios by creating low-carbon indices and identifying areas for research and engagement. From the case studies on the slide, you can see that it's used both to assess individual companies' management strategies and for larger strategic priorities around emissions reductions of portfolios. For example, the New York State Common Retirement Fund used CDP data to create a $2 billion low-carbon index that actually has an emissions profile 74% its benchmark of the Russell 1000. By disclosing to CDP, a company can also communicate this information to the broader ESG marketplace. Our data informs portfolio analysis and investment decisions in the financial sector. It enables large purchasers to better understand environmental risk throughout their supply chain. It underlies sustainability rankings and indices compiled by MSCI, Bloomberg, and others, and even contributes to the tracking of the commitments from U.S. companies and cities to remain aligned with the goals set out by the Paris Agreement. The dissemination of data through these different avenues really helps to magnify the visibility of a company's sustainability initiatives. In addition to providing information to requesting investors, data partners, and the public, CDP also provides feedback to the disclosing companies so they can learn from the process of disclosure. Disclosing to CDP provides the opportunity to benchmark against peer companies on qualitative and quantitative metrics, including emissions, targets, and strategies, to understand how peers are addressing environmental challenges your company may also face. CDP works to incentivize best practices in environmental management in a variety of ways, some of which are highlighted here. For example, companies who achieve leadership according to CDP's scoring methodology are recognized on our annual A-lists. We are also involved in the We Mean Business Coalition and the Science-Based Targets Initiative, through which companies are encouraged to set ambitious targets for emissions reductions and to make other sorts of environmental commitments, ranging from 100% renewable energy to responsible policy engagement. Every year, we try to encourage further action, and we are now turning a greater focus on encouraging companies to understand their impacts beyond just those within a company's operational boundary. Last year, for example, we began rating companies on their supplier engagement to help highlight the importance of managing impact down their supply chains. CDP is constantly evolving to remain in line with the changing landscape of environmental risk assessment, management, and reporting. This year, we've implemented sector-specific questionnaires for certain high-impact industries in order to allow for more effective benchmarking of companies on metrics relevant to their operations. Additionally, we've aligned our questionnaires with the recommendations put forth by the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. For those unfamiliar with the TCFD, this was a group of stakeholders from the private sector convened by the Financial Stability Board to put forth recommendations for the most valuable climate-related financial metrics for companies to disclose on. CDP has fully aligned with those recommendations, which have support from hundreds of investors and other private sector organizations. I'm going to go ahead and stop there. I hope this has been a valuable introduction to CDP's work and our disclosure process. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to our corporate engagement team at engagement.northamerica@cdp.net. Thanks again.
Great, thanks so much. So as you just heard from CDP, there's a lot of different categories in the climate change questionnaire. And what we really want to focus on today is how NSF International can help you with a few of these. So we can help you in all of these areas, but more specifically, I want to talk about these ones highlighted in blue. So the first is the risks and opportunities assessment. The second is targets and performance. And we'll be talking about emissions and energy kind of in one category, and also with engagement. And overall, the fifth way that we can really help is by looking at the bigger picture at all of these different categories and what you disclose to the CDP and help you identify gaps and areas for improvement in what you've already provided in your questionnaire. So I'll start with that one. You know, the climate change questionnaire is a really intense reporting framework, and there's a lot in it. And so what we can help you do is take what you've already disclosed and help you review what you've responded to, compare those responses against the CDP scoring methodology, and then benchmark your scoring against peers. So what's really great about the CDP Climate Change questionnaire is that, you know, a lot of people disclose, a lot of these reports are public, and it's really helpful to get a sense of like what peers in your industry are doing. We can also help identify areas for response improvement or expansion. So sometimes when we respond to a question, we often don't respond maybe in the way that we should, right? So maybe we're not really disclosing as fully as we might want to, and that having a second set of eyes on that can really help close some of those gaps. In addition to that, in addition to identifying areas for improvement in the questionnaire, we can also think about areas for improvement institutionally. So perhaps the questionnaire responses aren't really fully expanded upon because maybe you weren't thinking about these things in your company yet. So we can help identify some of those areas for you, and then ultimately come up with a plan for not only a better CDP climate change response, but also for climate action and improved performance. And basically, again, accurately and fully disclosing to the CDP climate change questionnaire can be really challenging. So this type of gap assessment, it really allows you to have an opportunity for a third party to take a look at what to improve upon or expand upon. It provides feedback for which areas, are well informed and perhaps which need more robust responses or systems attached to it. And also recommendations for how to improve your disclosure and perhaps try to get a better score by assessing against the CDP scoring methodology. And then ultimately a plan to improve your response, but also your climate actions in the company in general. And just an example of what this could look like, right? We can kind of break it down into the different categories in the CDP questionnaire, and then identify areas that are complete, partially complete, maybe not fully compliant. So we want to get a chance to look at that and provide strategic opportunities in each one of those areas. So the second area NSF International can help is through a risk and opportunity assessment. There are lots of different ways to do this, but ultimately, as many of you guys know, there are a lot of different risks that all companies are facing. And right now, a lot of those could be question marks for you. And what's more challenging, especially as supply chains are becoming more intricate and complex and global, they're all very interconnected. And it can be really daunting thinking about what those risks are and where those opportunities could be. And the goal really here is to take those question marks and turn them into tangible concepts, right? Things that actually make sense and that you can try to focus on, but then also prioritizing to help you come up with a data-driven and informed decision. So rather than having 20 different risks to look at, perhaps you just want to focus on, 3 or 4. So it's just an example of how prioritizing can help you come up with a little bit more tangible, strategic way to move forward. And then ultimately with that, you can measure those risks. You can rank them based on risk likelihood, their potential impact on your company, but also on the environment. You can prioritize them by what is important to your company, maybe to your mission or your goals. And also you can assess them by location. So maybe one area, a particular risk is really prominent, and maybe another area in your business it's not. And based on those risks, once you're able to rank them and identify which ones to focus on, that's really when you can come in and develop mitigation opportunities and alternatives and feasibility assessment to determine which ones maybe we can do now, what ones we can do later, and then incorporate them into your strategy. So that could be in your overall strategic goals for your company, or perhaps your sustainability goals if you have them, but then also develop procedures and implementation plans to make those, to really address those risks that you identify in your company. And then coming up with the finances for it, whether it requires additional personnel or you want to get some foresight into what future budgets need to look like in order to mitigate some of these risks. And NSF International has a proprietary risk scanning tool. It's called FRust. So FRust stands for the Fully Integrated Risk Scanning Tool. And this is often a way that we help clients identify risks in their supply chain. And it's really tailored towards food companies, but we can tailor it towards others. But what you're seeing here today is mostly based on food. But in that big gray box, we like to bucket these risks into environmental and operational risks, but also in the big blue box into social and corporate image risks. And we break those two themes down into macro risks, which you're seeing on the right-hand side. So natural climate risks, ecosystem impact risks, etc. And we even break that down further into actionable micro risks. So as you can see here on the gray side, and environmental operational risks, underneath natural climate risks, we have identified 5 potential micro risks that we can help scan your supply chain to figure out, maybe what needs to be improved on and what you should focus on in the next year. So whether it's extreme temperature, water scarcity, flood occurrence, sea level rise, frequency of extreme weather, those are just a few examples. But ultimately, what that risk scan allows you to do is come up with a very strategic priority. So there are 27 risk indicators in this scanning tool. And again, maybe the goal is to identify 3 to 5. And just if you have a 3-tier supply chain, just to give you a sense of how much data is going into this risk scan, there's at least 700 data points that come from company information, industry information, commodity information, and geography information. And again, this is really what we recommend as the first step in supply chain risk management. To show you an output of what that tool can look like is over here on the right-hand side. So you're seeing all the 27 different indicators and how they rank in terms of risk likelihood. So you'll notice here, you can kind of get a sense of like maybe what we should prioritize already. And for this company, it was a juice company, and they were making some claims on their packaging that wasn't really substantiated. So we identified that market claims is actually a really big risk for them. So that's why you're seeing it so high there. And you can also see this in a different output. So first prioritizes risks in 3 different ways in this graph. So on the x-axis is what you just saw, is the risk likelihood. So you can see market claims is the most risky in this scanning tool, but then you're also getting a sense on the y-axis of how these risks are prioritized by the company. So even though market claims is more risky, it's not as much of a priority for the company as some other things such as extreme temperature and water scarcity. So ultimately the goal of this is to really identify things in the upper right quadrant and pinpoint specific targeted and actionable items to dive deeper into. And the area of the circle is actually the potential for impact. So here, market claims the potential for impact isn't quite as big as extreme temperature. So again, it's just kind of a gauge to see which ones maybe we want to focus on first. The third service that we can provide to help you with your CDP disclosure is in setting targets and assessing performance. So what you just saw was a risk and opportunity assessment, which is a really great way to identify what targets you maybe want to focus on. But another one is a materiality assessment. It uses a similar logic, right? We want to plot stakeholder priorities on the y-axis, and then on the x-axis is the potential for impact on the environment. And you can do this by surveying a ton of different stakeholders or maybe just a smaller sample. It's really up to the company and how broad you want this materiality assessment to be. But ultimately, you can figure out a targeted set of areas you want to focus on by just looking in the upper right quadrant. And you can slice and dice this graph however you want. But ultimately, in this case, there were 6 different issues that were identified as being material for that company. And then those material issues can then be translated into sustainability development goals or targets. And what we often do at NSF International is when helping companies determine what quantifiable and science-based sustainability goals should look like, we often take a materiality assessment or a risk and opportunity scan and help them go through this process of determining whether or not the goal or metric that we're thinking of makes sense. So the first way to do that is ask the question, are we quantifying a specific sustainability concern? Like, is this relevant? Is the target we've identified or the concept we've identified important? Not only on a global level, but also on a local level. And we also want to make sure that the way we're measuring this metric is defensible. So would somebody else agree with how this metric is being quantified? The third thing is making sure it's meaningful in the sense that it's forward thinking, that it'll drive potentially like future company and customer decisions. And lastly, and very importantly, making sure that those goals are communicated very clearly. So sometimes we tend to think about greenhouse gas emissions, for example, and come up with an absolute number of decreased greenhouse gas emissions. But what does that mean for the average consumer? It's really difficult to bridge that gap and understand how that actually affects them in the long term and in the short term, and making sure that those goals are communicated in a time-bound way so that your stakeholders, your investors and consumers can keep you honest with how you're meeting and measuring those goals. The fourth category of ways that we can help with CDP disclosure is by doing greenhouse gas emissions inventory and an energy audit or analysis. So here you're looking at a supply chain for a yogurt company. So there are 6 different stages in the supply chain, and ultimately all the greenhouse gas emissions wrap up into this total number. And getting that total number is really helpful to know how many greenhouse gas emissions are emitted throughout your entire supply chain, but it's not very actionable. So what we like to do is break down that data and determine, like maybe by stage, what we should focus on. So in this case, the cattle ranch stage is clearly the most emitting, so maybe this company would want to focus more on that stage. We can also do that based on facility. So, as you can see on the left side of this graph, there are a lot of different cattle ranches up here, but there's also some feed production facilities that are really high emitting. So if we only focus on greenhouse gas emissions by stage, we don't necessarily capture that. So I think different ways of analyzing and diving into this data is something that oftentimes companies struggle with, and we can help not only to measure the greenhouse gas emissions, but also try to figure out where those reduction strategies are really going to be the most beneficial. And measuring and tracking electricity and energy consumption, it helps you provide insight, especially when you look historically on a company. And so this is just an example of a facility over the course of a decade. So you can see in the beginning, in 2005, they had a really robust, energy reduction strategy implemented. They started developing it. And then by 2009, there was a huge decrease because all of the building updates and renovations were completed. All the plans and strategies were in place, and you could see there's a huge difference there. What's interesting is that, the electricity consumption started to spike again. And there's a really simple reason for that. A new energy intensive laboratory was brought online. So after they realized that, the electricity consumption was increasing, they realized they needed to revise that strategy and develop a new way to create a reduction target. And so having that historical view is really helpful, and it allows you to think more in the future about different facility things that are coming online. Once baselines have been established, like maybe an energy audit or carbon footprint or greenhouse gas emission inventory, then that's really when we can start to develop reduction initiatives. And in terms of a building, for example, there are lots of different ways you can do that. You can assess against ASHRAE, LEED, ENERGY STAR. You can do an energy management type of audit and system. But ultimately, energy savings really come from two different places. They come from capital investments, so purchasing something to make sure that your energy reduction is happening, but then also operational changes. So just to give you a quick example of what that could look like, this is a graph showing the primary EUI, which is energy use intensity. And you can see on the left column, that's kind of what is already existing, what the stock value is on average in commercial companies. And even just by going to Energy Star appliances, the reduction is potentially 21%. And if you look at the best available in class, you can reduce your energy consumption by 50% potentially. So it gives you a little bit of an idea of how much there is there in terms of capital investments that you can make to help decrease your energy consumption. But there are also things that you can do operationally. So this graph is showing the heating degree and cooling degree days on the bars. And so that's not really important to focus on, but I do want to point out that the green line and the yellow line indicates the difference in steam consumption over the course of 1 year. And that big difference really resulted in just switching off one valve manually. So by doing 5 seconds of work once a year, a lot of money and energy was saved in this particular facility. The fifth thing that we can help with is really engagement, and not only engagement in terms of your suppliers, but also with your industry. So as you saw earlier, the CDP scoring levels are here. So, if you really want to be a leader in the CDP climate change disclosure and in the climate change space in general, you really need to be deeply engaged with your industry and with your stakeholders. And those leaders are doing this in a couple of different ways. They're looking at their value chain, engaging with their suppliers and their customers and other partners. They're involved in trade and industry associations and in research. They're involved in policy making and then in public reporting, which oftentimes in this case, we're thinking of sustainability reporting. And, engaging with suppliers is extremely important. And there's a different range of engagement that you can go into. So in the bottom here, there's a broad level of engagement where you're just basically setting and communicating expectations, working with your suppliers, a little bit about what your expectations are in terms of sustainability. But then moving up this pyramid, you really start to become a little bit more engaged in terms of being a partner. And that is the ultimate goal, collaborating and sharing values with your suppliers and really having strong relationships in this task of mitigating climate change is really deep engagement that I think a lot of these leaders are starting to strive for. And there's a lot of different ways that you can engage with your suppliers and incentivize and encourage positive responses. And these are just some examples. But I think oftentimes what we've been hearing lately is a lot of people are engaging with their suppliers in terms of supplier questionnaires. So just really getting a overview of what their suppliers are doing and how they're reporting on their goals, how they're aligning with different certification schemes, and just get a little bit more sense of what they're doing in their industry, and that all can flow back up into the corporate goals. And then the other thing is, of course, setting and communicating targets, which is a huge focus not only for a lot of companies, but also for the CDP questionnaire. And there's a lot of ways you can do that. Sustainability reporting is a really great way to communicate the goals and targets that you set as a company, and it's a really positive way to build brand transparency and customer trust. And so one of the most common ways that we're seeing sustainability reports is with the GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative. It's a really great framework that can help you organize your data and really report out on the really important social, environmental, and economic standards. And these are directly related to the materiality assessment that you saw earlier. That's actually a precursor of this process. And so it's a really great framework to use, and we can help you navigate that if you want to report based on the GRI framework. A lot of people are also putting their CDP climate change disclosures in their sustainability reports. And also the water and forest questionnaires are also the supply chain questionnaire. So it's a really great way to showcase what you're doing for the CDP through an external audience in your sustainability reporting. A lot of companies are also focusing their goals and targets and their reports in general based on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So many of you guys know what these are. There's 17 goals that nearly 200 countries have signed on, and they're really using this to drive their client decisions because it's a global presence. Everyone knows what these goals are, and everyone's aligned in meeting them. So it's a really great way for your company to make sure you're focusing on global issues. But also, a lot of companies want to customize their reports, so we can help with that as well. And it may be a combination of all three of these: CDP, UN SDG, and GRI, or it could be something completely different. It's up to you. But we've helped a lot of clients, build their reports, but also make sure that they're reporting on what their customers and their investors are interested in learning about. The last thing I wanted to show you today is the readiness tool. So we've created a CDP readiness assessment to kind of get a sense of whether or not you're ready to comply with the CDP climate change disclosure. And so we can show you a link to this on our website, but we ultimately just want to prepare you for what you might have to disclose on. So here you can see a lot of these questions are about 13 questions, and then you can indicate whether you're fully prepared to disclose on that area, if you're partially prepared, or if you're not prepared at all. And that'll give you a sense of maybe what you're about to embark on if you do decide to disclose to the CDP Climate Change questionnaire. So ultimately, I shared a lot of stuff with you today, but we talked about 5 ways that we can help to improve your CDP climate change disclosure. And what you're looking at here is, again, all of the different categories in that questionnaire. But I just want to highlight that, we can help you in terms of reviewing your current responses and confirming that you are actually responding the way that the questionnaire intended. But we can also help you evaluate and improve systems that you are already doing. So maybe if you already have a risks and opportunities assessment, but maybe you think it could be a little bit better, that's something we can help have an extra set of eyes on and see ways that we can help. And then the last thing is we can develop and design systems for you. And a lot of what I showed today is examples of that, but really serving as a strategic partner and helping you come up with very tangible ways to disclose on your climate change issues.
If you're interested in our CDP services or any of our other sustainability offerings, please reach out to us at sustainability@nsf.org or visit our website, nsf.org. We hope to hear from you soon. Thanks.